Hey everyone, tonight we step into a night that most modern comfort has completely forgotten how to imagine. A night with no walls in the way you're used to walls, no furnace humming somewhere out of sight, and no glass between you and a wind that has been building strength across an open plain for 100 miles with nothing to slow it down. Tonight, we're going back to a winter camp of the Great Plains, generations before insulation had a name, before anyone had heard the word thermostat. And we're going to spend the night the way families there actually spent it, warm, dry, and asleep, inside a structure made of poles and hide that did something modern buildings still struggle to do as gracefully. If you're new here, welcome to Bedtime Survivalist, where every night we quietly rebuild a piece of the past and let you rest inside it. Go ahead and get comfortable, because there is nothing left for you to do tonight but listen and drift. If the channel has been good company on a hard night, a like helps more than you'd think, and subscribing costs nothing and means we get to do this again tomorrow. And a genuine thank you to the viewer who requested tonight's topic in the comments a few weeks back. This one's for you and for everyone else who wants to know how people slept warm before anyone slept warm by pressing a button. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight and what the weather is doing outside your own walls right now. It's always something, hearing how many different kinds of cold are gathered here, listening to the same story. Now dim the lights, let the room go quiet, and if you have a fan or a heater humming somewhere nearby, let it run, because tonight that hum is going to stand in for a sound that meant everything to the people you're about to become. The low, steady crackle of a fire that someone is tending so that you don't have to. Let's begin with a question. If you had to build your own shelter tonight, right now, with nothing but wooden poles, animal hide, and the people around you, and you had exactly until sundown to finish it, before the temperature dropped low enough to kill you, would you know where to start? Would you know which way to face the door? Would you know how to keep a fire burning inside a room made of what is essentially a very large tent without slowly filling that room with smoke? The people who lived on the Great Plains knew all of this so completely that it looked effortless, the way anything looks effortless once someone has spent centuries perfecting it. Tonight, you're going to feel what they felt, moving through the last hour of a winter afternoon toward the safety of a fire that hasn't been lit yet. Settle in. The wind is already picking up. You are standing at the edge of a wide river valley as the light starts to fail, and the cold that has been merely uncomfortable all afternoon is beginning to turn serious. You can feel it in a particular way it has of finding the gaps in your clothing, the collar, the wrists, the place where your leggings meet your moccasins, testing each one like a hand checking a door. Above you the sky has gone the flat, grey-white of a coming storm, the kind of sky that doesn't threaten so much as promise. Somewhere behind you, out on the open plain you crossed today, that same wind has nothing to slow it down for 100 miles. It builds speed over grass and snow and empty distance until it finally meets something solid. And today, the something solid your family chose to meet it with is this valley, tucked low between two long ridges, with a line of cottonwoods breaking the worst of the gusts along the water's edge. This is not an accident. This is a decision made weeks ago when the first hard frost told everyone that summer's open, easily defended campsites on the high ground were no longer where anyone wanted to be. Winter camps are chosen with a different kind of care entirely, not for visibility or grazing, but for shelter from exactly the wind you feel pulling at you now. A river valley like this one does two things at once. It breaks the wind before it reaches the camp, and it keeps firewood close at hand in the cottonwoods and willows lining the bank, because a winter camp lives or dies by how much fuel is within walking distance on the coldest, darkest days when nobody wants to walk far for anything. Your family didn't choose this valley today. Someone chose it, and chose it well before the first snow ever fell, and today all you have to do is arrive in it and be grateful. Ahead of you, scattered along the flatter ground near the water, the camp is already taking shape in the dying light. Tipis in various stages of completion dot the valley floor, their pale hide covers catching what little sun remains. Smoke beginning to rise thin and grey from the ones already finished. The sound reaches you before the details do, voices calling instructions back and forth, the soft, continuous thud of wooden stakes being driven into half-frozen ground, dogs moving restlessly at the edges of everything, sensing the way dogs always sense that the temperature is about to become a real problem. You feel the specific hurry that comes over everyone in the last hour of daylight in winter, a hurry that has nothing to do with panic and everything to do with knowing exactly how much time is left and exactly how much work still needs doing inside it. Your family's own tipi is not yet standing. The poles lie in a loose bundle where they were dropped from the travois, and the great folded hide cover sits beside them like a tired animal waiting to be given shape again. This is the part of winter life that never appears in the finished picture, the part before the picture when a home is still just materials and cold hands and the fading light asking everyone to hurry. You know this process. You have watched it, helped with it, will one day direct it yourself. But tonight, you feel it the way it actually felt, urgent and physical and entirely dependent on getting every step right, because in an hour, the temperature will drop hard enough that being wrong about any of it stops being an inconvenience and starts being dangerous. Someone hands you the end of a long pole, and the work begins. The first 3 poles go up together, tied near their tops with a length of rawhide rope, then spread at the base into a tripod that will carry the weight of everything else. This is the moment the whole structure decides what shape it's going to be, and it happens fast. 3 poles lifted and leaned and locked into place by hands that have done this hundreds of times before and know exactly how much lean is too much lean. You watch the tripod rise against the grey sky, 3 dark lines meeting at a point, and there is something almost unreasonable about how such a simple shape is about to become warm enough to sleep in during a night this cold. More poles follow, laid one at a time into the crook where the first 3 meet, each one settled into place and the whole growing structure checked, adjusted, checked again. This is not guesswork. The number of poles, their spacing, the angle at which they lean inward, all of it has been worked out and refined and passed down until it exists less as a set of rules anyone consciously follows and more as something the hands simply know. Somewhere between 15 and 25 poles, depending on the size of the lodge, each one doing its share of holding up a structure that has to survive wind loads a modern building code would take seriously. You lift, you position, you step back, and slowly a bare wooden cone rises out of the valley floor, empty and skeletal against the darkening sky, waiting for its skin. The cover comes next, and this is where the real weight of the work shows itself. The great hide cover, sewn from many tanned buffalo skins into a single enormous half-circle, has to be lifted, unfolded, and wrapped around the entire pole frame in one continuous motion, 2 or 3 people working together, hauling on ropes, guiding the heavy material up and around, while it fights them with its own weight and the wind's growing interest in taking it somewhere else. You feel the cold in your palms as you grip the rawhide lacing pins, working your way up the seam where the 2 edges of the cover meet at the front, pinning them together one by one from the ground up toward the smoke opening high above. Each pin closes the gap a little more, and with each one closed, you can feel the interior of the space beginning to exist, beginning to become somewhere, rather than nowhere. The base of the cover gets staked down hard against the ground every few feet, driven in with a wooden mallet through half-frozen earth that resists every blow. This is not a decorative detail. This is the difference between a shelter that holds through a night of plains wind and one that doesn't, and everyone working on it knows it, which is why nobody rushes this part even as the light continues to fail around them. At the top, 2 long pole-controlled flaps. The ear flaps are adjusted and angled against tonight's wind direction, a small piece of engineering that will matter enormously in a few hours once there's a fire going inside and smoke needs somewhere honest to go. Someone climbs partway up on a second person's shoulders to make the final adjustment, calling down corrections, a small human tower working against the last grey light of the day, and then, almost without a clear moment where it happens, it is finished. A tipi stands where an hour ago there was only cold ground and a pile of poles. It leans slightly with the land, its pale cover already ticking softly as the wind tests it, and finds, this time, that it holds. You step back and look at it the way you always do at this moment, with a kind of tired satisfaction that has nothing to do with admiring how it looks and everything to do with knowing what it means. It means that whatever the temperature does tonight, whatever the wind decides to throw across this valley in the dark hours ahead, there is now a place for your family to be warm inside it. The hardest part of the day is done. The next part, the part that actually keeps you alive through the night, is only just beginning. And it starts the moment someone ducks through the low doorway, carrying the first armful of firewood. You follow them inside, out of the wind, into a darkness that smells of new leather and cold earth, and you wait for the first spark. Inside, the tipi is still just a cone of hide and shadow, the last grey daylight leaking weakly through the smoke opening far above, and the ground beneath your feet is nothing yet but packed dirt, cold enough that you can feel it through the soles of your moccasins. But you are not alone in here for long. Someone else ducks through the low doorway behind you, carrying a second bundle, this one not firewood but hide, a great soft roll of tanned skins that gets carried to the far wall and unfolded with the same unhurried care that went into raising the poles outside. This is the inner lining, and if the outer cover is what keeps the wind and snow on the outside of your world tonight, this is what keeps the warmth on the inside of it, and the 2 jobs, it turns out, are not quite the same job at all. The liner is hung from a rope strung around the interior of the tipi at about the height of a standing adult's shoulders. its lower edge tucked down under the same stones and stakes that hold the outer cover to the ground, its upper edge left loose a few feet below, where the poles converge overhead. What this creates, once it's fully hung and the last edge tucked into place, is a narrow open channel running all the way around the inside wall of the lodge, a gap of moving air trapped between two layers of hide, the outer one facing the brutal cold of the night and the inner one facing you. It looks, if you step back and think about it, almost like nothing, a curtain hung a short distance in from a wall. But this nothing is doing more work than almost anything else in the entire structure, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. Exactly why? Cold air is heavy, and it sinks. Warm air is light, and it rises. Anyone who has ever stood near a fire on a winter night already knows this, without needing it explained, has felt the way heat gathers near the ceiling of a room while the floor stays stubbornly cold. The gap between the liner and the outer cover uses this simple fact on purpose. As the fire in the center of the lodge warms the air around it, that warm air rises toward the smoke opening at the peak, and as it rises it draws replacement air in through the bottom edge of the outer cover, air that has to travel up through the gap between the two layers of hide before it can enter the main living space. By the time that air reaches you, it has already been sitting against a layer of hide that the rising warm air from the fire is constantly passing near, and the cold has been taken off its worst edge before it ever touches your skin. Meanwhile, the smoke, light and hot, has almost nowhere to go but straight up and out through the opening at the top, because the liner is quietly herding the air currents in the room to make sure of it. It is, in the plainest possible terms, a chimney and an insulating layer built into the same simple piece of hung hide, designed by people who never once called it either of those things and simply knew, from lifetimes of cold nights and careful attention, that it worked. You run your hand along the inner surface of the liner as it's being smoothed into place, feeling the softness of hair side in tanning, and you notice something else too, something practical rather than scientific. The gap between the two layers isn't wasted space, it becomes storage. A narrow shelf running the whole circumference of the lodge where tools, parfleshes of dried meat, extra robes, and anything else that doesn't need to be in the main living area can be tucked out of the way without ever leaving the warmth of the tipi's interior. Nothing here is doing only one job. The liner insulates, the liner ventilates, the liner stores, and it does all three at once with a piece of hide and a length of rope hung by people who inherited a solution refined over more winters than anyone could count. Outside, full dark has arrived while you worked, and you can hear the wind pressing steadily against the outer cover, a low, continuous sound, like the valley itself breathing. Inside, though, in the gap between what the wind can reach and what you can feel, something has already changed. The air doesn't move the way it did when you first walked in. It hangs still and close around you, waiting only for a fire to give it a reason to start circulating in earnest. You look up, and through the adjusted opening at the peak of the poles framed on either side by the two ear flaps, someone tuned so carefully against tonight's wind, you can just make out a narrow strip of sky, the first hard stars of a clear, cold night, visible through a gap no wider than a hand's span. It is, you realize, the only true window in the entire structure, and it exists purely because smoke has to leave somewhere, and someone worked out exactly how wide that somewhere needs to be to let the smoke out without ever letting the warmth follow it. Someone crouches at the centre of the lodge now over a small cleared circle of bare earth, ringed with stones, and begins the last and most important task of the evening before anyone can properly call this place home. A handful of dry inner bark, shredded fine, goes down first. A loose tangle of the smallest dead twigs the camp could gather on the way in follows on top of it, arranged with the kind of unhurried precision that only comes from having built this exact small architecture thousands of times before. A spark is struck, caught, coaxed, breathed on gently, breathed on again, and then all at once there is a small flame where a moment ago there was only cold air and waiting kindling. It is a small fire, deliberately small, nothing like the wide bonfires you might picture from a summer story told around one of these same lodges months earlier. A winter lodge fire is kept modest and steady, not because a bigger fire wouldn't feel better in the first shivering minutes, but because fuel is precious out here, gathered by hand and carried in against the cold, and a fire that burns too large too fast is a fire that runs out of fuel by midnight, long before the coldest hours of the night have even arrived. You watch the small flame catch, spread, settle into a steady glow no larger than two cupped hands held together, and already you can feel the difference it makes. Not a wave of heat exactly, but a presence, a centre, a point around which the whole dark interior of the lodge quietly reorganizes itself. With the fire finally lit and beginning its quiet, steady work at the centre of the lodge, attention turns to the ground itself, because a fire alone, no matter how well tended, will never be enough to keep a body warm through a plains winter night if that body is lying directly against frozen earth. This is a lesson every winter camp learns early and never forgets, that cold rises up through you from below just as readily as it presses in on you from the sides, and that the space between your body and the ground matters every bit as much as the space between your body and the wind. The work of preparing the sleeping areas begins along the outer wall of the lodge, arranged in a rough circle around the central fire, each family's sleeping space claimed by habit and unspoken agreement rather than any argument, because everyone already knows where they sleep, has slept there every winter of their life, and will keep sleeping there until age or circumstance moves them somewhere else. The first layer down is often a simple platform, a low frame of willow branches lashed together and raised just a few inches off the bare ground, enough to break the direct contact between sleeper and earth without taking up much of the limited floor space inside. Where a full platform isn't built, thick mats woven from grass or rushes serve the same purpose, laid down flat and overlapping, a woven barrier between the cold below and the warmth being built above it. Onto this base go the hides, and here is where the real weight of winter preparation shows itself, because a single thin layer of anything is never going to be enough against a plains winter. And everyone in this lodge learned that lesson from someone who learned it the hard way generations before any of them were born. Buffalo robes form the foundation of every sleeping place, thick and heavy, tanned with the hair left on, and laid down with the deep fur facing upward first, creating an immediate cushion of insulation between the sleeper and whatever thin barrier separates them from the ground below. You lift one of these robes yourself and feel its real weight, heavier than any blanket you've handled before. dense with the kind of insulating loft that only comes from an animal that spent its own life surviving winters exactly like this one. More layers follow. A second robe, sometimes worn with the hide side up and the fur down against the first layer, trapping a cushion of still air between the two. The same principle that made the wall liner work, now put to use flat on the ground instead of hung upright around it. Smaller hides and softer furs go on top of these: rabbit, fox, whatever the season's hunting provided, saved specifically for their softness rather than their bulk, meant to sit closest to the skin where comfort matters as much as warmth. And over everything, once the sleeper actually lies down, comes at least one more heavy robe pulled up and over, sometimes two, arranged so there is no gap at the shoulders or the feet for cold air to find its way in and settle there through the night. This is not simple bedding thrown down in a hurry. It is a layered system, built with the same careful logic that shaped the lodge itself. Dead air trapped between materials, heavy insulation below to fight the ground's cold, and lighter insulation above to trap the body's own warmth without crushing it flat. You notice, watching an older woman arrange her own sleeping place with quick practiced hands, that she checks the platform for any give or unevenness before laying down a single hide, smoothing a low spot here, adding an extra bundle of dried grass there, because a poorly prepared bed tonight isn't just a matter of comfort. It is a matter of whether the cold finds a way in through some overlooked gap sometime after midnight when the fire has burned low and there's no one awake yet to notice. Children's sleeping places get extra attention tucked in closer to the fire than the adults, wrapped in the softest and warmest of the available hides, sometimes bedded down two or three together so their own body heat adds to what the robes are already holding in. An elder's place, too, often sits nearer the fire's steady warmth than a place near the cold outer wall would allow, a quiet, practical form of respect built directly into the geography of where everyone sleeps. Nothing about the arrangement is random. The whole circle of sleeping places around the fire has been worked out the same way the lodge poles were worked out, through trial, through hard nights that taught hard lessons, through the accumulated and freely shared knowledge of exactly whose body needs to be exactly how close to the heat on a night this cold. You settle briefly onto the edge of one finished sleeping place just to feel it. The give of the willow platform beneath the layered robes, the way the fur closes softly around your hand when you press it flat against the topmost hide. It is warm already, warm before you've even properly lain down in it, warm in the way that only a great deal of careful, unglamorous preparation can make something warm. Outside, the wind is still finding every gap it can in the outer cover of the lodge, still pressing and testing, and occasionally rattling a loose lacing pin somewhere up near the doorway. In here, on this bed, built in careful layers against exactly that wind, none of it reaches you at all. The last of the day's outdoor light has fully gone now, and through the smoke opening high above, the strip of sky has turned from grey to a deep, star-scattered black. The fire glows steadily at the centre of the lodge, low and controlled, casting long, soft shadows that move gently across the inside of the hide walls whenever someone shifts position nearby. Somewhere outside, muffled by layers of hide and distance, you can hear the low murmur of the wider camp settling in for the night too. Other fires being banked, other voices dropping into the quieter register that belongs to evening. Inside your own lodge, the hardest work of the day is finished. The shelter stands, the fire burns, the beds are laid, and there is nothing left now but the last, quiet ritual before sleep. The one that has nothing to do with survival at all, and everything to do with why surviving is worth doing. That last ritual begins the moment the evening's real work is done, when the beds are laid and the fire has settled into its steady, low burn. And everyone in the lodge finally allows themselves to stop moving and simply sit. You lower yourself onto your own prepared robes, pulling the topmost one up over your knees, and feel your body register, all at once, just how long a day this has been. The cold outside no longer matters in the way it mattered an hour ago. It has become something happening to someone else, out past the hide walls, out past the wind that keeps testing the lodge and keeps finding it holds. In here, in the low orange light of a fire that someone will keep feeding through the hours ahead, the evening has entered its quieter phase. This is when the talking starts, unhurried, the way conversation only happens once every practical task of the day has already been handled and nobody needs anything else from anybody. An older voice, maybe a grandparent, maybe simply the person in the lodge who carries the most stories, begins something low and familiar, a telling that might be old enough that everyone present has heard some version of it dozens of times before and will happily hear it again tonight, because a story told, well, doesn't wear out with repetition, it deepens. Winter nights on the plains were, among everything else they were, a season for exactly this. Long dark hours when the day's outdoor work was finished early and there was nothing left to do but gather close to a fire and pass down, voice to voice, the accumulated memory of a people, one telling at a time. You listen, half drowsing already, to the rhythm of it more than the specific words, the pauses placed just so, the small laughs from someone else in the lodge at a line they've heard so many times they could say it along with the speaker if they wanted to. Somewhere near the doorway, a dog that slipped in earlier and was allowed this once, this cold to stay, has curled itself into the warmest available space and is already asleep, one ear occasionally twitching at some sound only it can hear, beyond the walls. Its presence there is not just tolerated, it's useful. A small extra warmth near the entrance and an early set of ears that will know before any human does if something outside the lodge, wind or animal or stranger, deserves waking up for. The fire needs attention through all of this, and you notice how naturally it happens, almost without anyone announcing that they're doing it. A hand reaches out during a pause in the story and adds a single piece of wood, small, considered, exactly enough to keep the flame steady, without building it up past what the night's fuel supply can sustain. This will happen again and again through the hours ahead, long after the story has ended and everyone else is asleep. Because someone, usually whoever's sleeping place sits closest to the fire, whoever's internal sense of time is most reliably tuned to waking on its own in the deep hours of the night, will stir every so often to feed the coals before they can die down too far. It is a quiet, half-conscious duty, done in the dark without needing to fully wake. A hand finding a piece of wood by feel alone and placing it exactly where it needs to go before its owner sinks back down into their robes. This is, if you think about it, the real machinery keeping everyone alive tonight. Not any single dramatic act, but this small, repeated, half-asleep tending hour after hour, someone's hand reaching out into the cold air beyond the blankets just long enough to keep a fire from dying, then withdrawing back into the warmth to sleep a little more, before doing it again. Nobody complains about this duty. Nobody even really discusses it. It has simply always been done by whoever's turn it naturally falls to on a given night. The way certain kinds of care become invisible once they've been practiced long enough, noticed only in their absence. Outside, the wind has not stopped, and it will not stop for hours yet, but you've noticed something interesting happen to how it sounds. It has become, somewhere in the last hour, less of a threat and more of a backdrop, the way any sound eventually does once you've decided the shelter around you can handle it. You catch yourself listening to it the way you might listen to rain against a window, a sound that belongs entirely outside the boundary of your own safety, present but no longer pressing. The lodge holds, the fire holds, the robes hold their careful warmth around you. Everything that needed to be built tonight has been built, and everything that needs to be tended will keep being tended, quietly, through however many hours of darkness remain before the grey edge of morning finally starts to show again through the smoke opening overhead. The story from earlier has wound down now, or perhaps you simply stopped following it somewhere in the last few minutes. The way sleep tends to arrive, not as a decision, but as a slow tide that eventually covers everything without announcing exactly when it started. Around you, the breathing in the lodge has settled into the slow, even rhythm of people who are mostly or entirely asleep, punctuated occasionally by the soft shift of someone turning over in their robes, or the smaller stir of a hand reaching toward the fire and back. The dog by the doorway hasn't moved in some time. The wind outside continues its long argument with the cottonwoods along the river, an argument it will lose again tonight, the way it loses every night against a shelter built exactly to withstand it. You feel your own eyes growing heavier, the warmth of the layered robes finally doing the last of its quiet work, pulling you down and under. Above you, through the narrow opening at the peak of the poles, the stars are still there, cold and distant and entirely unable to reach you here. The fire glows low and orange at the center of everything, tended, watched over, kept alive by hands that will keep reaching out for it long after you've stopped noticing. And somewhere, in that last drifting moment before sleep takes you fully, you understand, without needing to put it into words, exactly what this lodge is, not just poles and hide and fire, a whole accumulated knowledge, generations deep, built specifically so that a family could lie down on the coldest night of the plains winter, and simply, safely, warmly sleep. Somewhere in the deepest hour of the night, the hour that has no clock to mark it, but makes itself known anyway by a particular quality of stillness, you surface partway out of sleep without ever fully waking. It's the cold that does it, not a sharp cold, nothing like what waits beyond the lodge walls, but a small, specific chill at the edge of your shoulder, where the topmost robe has slipped slightly out of place during the hours you've been turning in your sleep. Your hand finds it before your mind has properly caught up, pulling the heavy fur back up into place, tucking it beneath your chin the way it was arranged hours ago, and already the cold at your shoulder is retreating, already you're sinking back down towards sleep. This is the plains winter night in miniature, 100 small corrections like this one, made half-consciously, made by instinct built from a lifetime of exactly these nights, keeping the careful architecture of warmth intact, even while the person maintaining it is barely aware they're doing it at all. Across the lodge, you're dimly aware of movement, the particular soft sounds of someone else stirring, sitting up just enough to reach toward the fire. The coals have burned down further than they were an hour ago, glowing a deeper red now, less flame than ember, and a piece of wood is added carefully, angled to catch, and for a moment there's the small hiss and pop of new fuel meeting old heat, before the sound settles back into quiet. This will happen 4 or 5 times before morning, this same small ritual performed by whoever's sleep is lightest tonight, or whoever's body has simply learned, through years of these nights, to wake on schedule without needing to be told. You've done this yourself on other nights, know the particular feeling of surfacing from sleep in total darkness, finding the woodpile by memory and feel rather than sight, placing a single piece exactly where it needs to go, and returning to your robes before you're even fully certain you were awake at all. Outside, the wind has changed character sometime in these deep hours, no longer the steady pressing gusts of early evening, but something colder and more searching. The kind of wind that arrives in the very early morning hours on the plains and means the true bottom of the night's temperature is close at hand. You can hear it working at the lodge cover more insistently now, a low, continuous hum along the hide, occasionally rising into something sharper as a stronger gust finds its way past the windbreak of trees along the river. Somewhere, out past the edge of camp, faint and distant, a coyote calls, and another answers from somewhere further off, the sound carrying strangely across frozen ground, the way sound does on nights this cold, and this still beneath the wind. Inside, nobody stirs at it. The dog near the doorway lifts its head briefly, ears turning toward the sound, decides after a moment that it doesn't concern anyone inside this particular lodge tonight, and settles back down with a low sigh. This is, in its way, the true test of everything that was built earlier in the day, not the moment the last stake was driven into the ground or the last lacing pin closed, but this one, hours later, in the coldest and least forgiving part of the night, when nobody is awake to actively defend the shelter, and it simply has to hold on its own, on the strength of decisions made in daylight by tired, careful hands. And it does hold. The wind that has spent the whole night testing every seam and gap in the outer cover keeps finding seam after seam, gap after gap, that there isn't one worth the effort, that the lacing holds, that the base stays staked, that the smoke flaps, adjusted so precisely hours ago against exactly this wind direction, continue doing their quiet job of letting rising warmth carry smoke up and out while the cold stays exactly where it belongs, on the far side of a wall that was built to keep it there. You drift in and out through these deep hours the way everyone in the lodge does, never fully surfacing, never fully gone, existing instead in that particular layered state of half-awareness that comes from being warm enough to trust the night completely. At some point, distantly, you're aware that the wind outside has begun to ease, its searching edge softening into something more like the ordinary steady breath of a plains night, rather than the sharper, hunting sound of a few hours before. The coldest part of the night, you understand somewhere beneath full waking thought, has already come, and already been survived, has tested this lodge at its worst and found the lodge equal to it, and now there is only the long remaining stretch of ordinary winter darkness left to pass through before the sky beyond the smoke opening begins eventually, to lighten again. The fire, tended through all of this by hands that never fully woke to do it, continues its low, steady work at the centre of everything. The last coals from tonight's wood settling into the kind of deep, patient burn that will hold until morning without needing much more from anyone. Around you, the whole lodge breathes in the slow unison of deep sleep. Your family scattered in their careful circle of robes and hides around a fire that has kept every one of them warm through hours cold enough, out beyond these walls, to threaten a life in far less time than it takes to properly tell a story. But out there is not in here. In here, wrapped in layered fur against a platform raised above the frozen ground, inside a cone of hide, built with a precision no one in this lodge would ever think to call precision, simply calling it, if asked, the way things have always been done. You are warm. You are safe. And somewhere above you, through that narrow gap in the poles where smoke rises and stars show through, the night is quietly, steadily turning toward morning. The morning arrives the way it always does in a winter lodge, not with sudden light, but with a slow, patient greying of the small strip of sky visible through the smoke opening high above. A strip that has held nothing but stars for what feels like the whole of the night, and now, gradually, begins to hold something paler instead. You wake before you mean to, the way the body sometimes does when the deepest cold of the night has finally passed, and something in you recognizes, even through sleep, that the worst of it is over. The fire at the centre of the lodge has burned down to a wide bed of grey-white ash, with a dull red heart still glowing somewhere underneath, low enough now that no one has fed it in some time, patient enough that it will hold there for a while yet without help. The first sound you're properly aware of is not inside the lodge at all, but outside it. A change in the wind, the long, insistent pressure of the night finally easing into something gentler, more like an ordinary morning breeze finding its way along the valley than the searching, testing gusts that worked at the outer cover for hours in the dark. You lie still for a moment beneath the weight of the robes, unwilling yet to trade this particular warmth for the cold air waiting just beyond it, and you notice, the way you always notice on a morning like this, exactly how much colder the very top layer of air in the lodge has become compared to down here, where you're lying, close to the ash-banked fire and wrapped in fur. Warm air rises and pools near the peak of the poles even now, even with the fire mostly spent. A last quiet echo of the whole system that kept you alive through the night, still doing its slow, patient work even as everyone inside it sleeps on a little longer. Someone else in the lodge is already moving, has been for a few minutes, you realize. The soft sounds of someone easing the ash aside to expose the coals beneath, adding the first sticks of the day with the same unhurried care that built this fire in the first place. There's a particular sound a cold fire makes as it's coaxed back toward flame, a series of small catches and hisses before it finally commits, and you listen to it happening now, the morning's whole warmth beginning to rebuild itself from what the night left behind. It occurs to you, listening, that this fire was never truly out at any point since it was lit yesterday evening, that what looks first thing in the morning like nothing more than grey ash and a hint of red is in fact the entire night's careful tending, paying off one final time. A fire kept alive on purpose, specifically so this exact moment, the relighting, would take minutes instead of the much longer, much colder process of starting completely from nothing. You sit up finally, robes pooling around you, and the cold air above the layer where you were sleeping meets your shoulders at once, sharper than anything you felt last night. Once the beds were made and the fire was going, a reminder that the lodge holds warmth in careful layers the same way your bedding did, denser and warmer near the ground and the fire thinner and cooler as you rise toward the smoke opening. Around the circle of the lodge, the rest of your family is stirring in their own time, nobody rushing, because there is nowhere urgent to be on a morning like this beyond simply beginning the day's necessary work, and the first of that work, always, is making sure the fire is properly awake before anyone steps outside to face the actual temperature of the morning. Outside, when you finally duck through the low doorway and straighten up into the pale early light, the valley looks different than it did last night. Quieter. The wind that pressed at the lodge for hours now settled into something almost gentle, though you can see by the drifted patterns of snow along every north-facing slope exactly how hard it was blowing only a few hours ago. Smoke rises from a dozen other lodges scattered across the camp, thin grey columns going straight up into a windless morning, each one a sign of exactly the same quiet, successful battle that played out in your own lodge overnight. Frost has gathered on everything left outdoors, on the stacked firewood, on the hide of a tethered horse whose breath shows in slow, visible clouds, on the bare branches of the cottonwoods, along the river that broke last night's worst wind before it ever reached the tipis at all. You notice, standing there in the cold, clear air of the morning, something that's easy to overlook when you're inside living through it, and much easier to see now from the outside, looking back. Every single lodge in this camp went through exactly what yours did last night. Every family raised the same careful structure, hung the same insulating liner, built the same layered beds, tended the same small patient fires through the same long cold hours, all of them working from the same inherited knowledge, all of them succeeding for the same practical, well-tested reasons. This isn't one family's clever trick. It's a whole community's shared understanding of how to survive a season that would kill any one of them alone, refined and passed down and practiced by everyone here until it stopped looking like knowledge at all and simply became the ordinary shape of how a winter night gets lived. That shared understanding shows itself most clearly not in any single lodge, but in the shape of the whole camp. And it's worth stepping back now in the calm of this cold morning to really look at how this winter camp sits in its valley, because nothing about its arrangement happened by accident. Where a summer camp might spread wide and loose across open, well-watered grassland, chosen for grazing and visibility and easy movement, a winter camp draws inward, tighter, closer, every lodge placed with real deliberation relative to the ones around it and to the land itself. You can see it now in the morning light, the way the tipis cluster along this stretch of the valley rather than scattering across it, the way the whole camp sits low, tucked behind the same line of cottonwoods, and the same protecting ridge that sheltered your own lodge, specifically because that same shelter serves every lodge equally. This clustering does real work beyond simple closeness. Lodges pitched nearer to one another block wind for each other in ways a single isolated tipi never could manage alone. each structure a partial windbreak for its neighbour, so that a lodge on the sheltered inner edge of the camp faces a noticeably gentler night than one would out on open ground by itself. Smoke from a dozen fires rising together into the cold morning air means a dozen families sharing not just physical proximity, but the simple reassurance of nearness, of knowing exactly how close help is if a lodge cover tears in a hard gust, if a fire gets away from its stones, if anyone needs another set of hands in the deep hours of a difficult night. You think about how different last night would have felt with your lodge standing alone somewhere out on the exposed plain above this valley. No windbreak of trees, no neighbouring lodges breaking the worst gusts. Just your family and the wind and whatever the structure alone could manage. And you understand a little better why nobody camps that way in winter if they can possibly avoid it. The choice of this particular valley, too, goes back further than anyone currently living in it, a decision refined over generations of families returning to the same general wintering grounds year after year, learning through hard experience which valleys held firewood close enough to gather without a long, dangerous walk in deep snow, which slopes broke wind most effectively, which stretches of river stayed reliably accessible for water, even when the surface iced over elsewhere. A band doesn't simply wander until winter forces a decision. It moves with real intention in the early autumn, well before the first hard freeze, toward wintering grounds already known, already proven, sometimes used by the same families for longer than anyone can precisely say. A kind of inherited geography is carefully maintained as the knowledge of how to raise a lodge or lace its cover against the cold. You walk a little way through the waking camp this morning, past lodges where smoke has thickened into full cooking fires, past a cluster of children bundled thick in furs, already at some game near the riverbank despite the cold, their breath clouding rapidly as they laugh and call to one another, entirely unbothered by a temperature that would have seemed impossible to imagine surviving outdoors back before you understood how thoroughly this camp had been built to handle it. An older man near one of the lodges is checking the lacing on his own tipi's cover, running a hand along the seam the way you might check on something that served you well and deserves acknowledgement for it, tightening a pin here, testing a stake there. Small maintenance performed not because anything failed overnight, but because a lodge that gets this kind of routine attention is a lodge less likely to fail on some future night when the maintenance would matter more. Horses stand tethered near several of the lodges, blanketed against the cold in their own way, their breath rising in the same visible clouds as everyone else's this morning. And you notice how even their placement within the camp reflects the same logic as everything else here, positioned to take some benefit from the same windbreak sheltering the lodges, cared for with the same attentive practicality that goes into every other winter decision this camp makes. Nothing here exists in isolation. The valley shelters the trees shelter the lodges shelter each other, and every family inside every lodge benefits from decisions made collectively, some of them decades or generations before anyone currently standing in this cold morning air was even born. Standing at the edge of camp, looking back at the low rise of smoke against a clearing winter sky, you feel something settle into place that the night before, focused entirely on your own family's small, urgent tasks, didn't have room to fully register. Surviving a night like the one just past was never really a solitary achievement, not for your family and not for any of the families whose fires you can see rising around you now. It was the visible result of an entire community's accumulated knowledge, tested and passed forward through more winters than anyone could count, arranged with quiet precision across this sheltered valley so that when the wind finally did come searching last night, testing every lodge, every seam, every family's careful preparation, it found, again and again, across the whole camp, exactly the same answer. Not this time, not tonight. Come back when you're stronger and we'll still be here. None of what kept you warm last night began last night. It began weeks earlier, in the last gold light of autumn, in work far less dramatic than raising a lodge against a coming storm, but every bit as essential to surviving one, and it's worth going back to that work now, because a robe that kept the cold off your shoulders in the deepest hour of the night didn't simply appear when winter arrived. It was made by hand over days of steady effort, by people who understood exactly how much their own comfort in the months ahead depended on getting this part right, while there was still time to do it properly. You remember, or perhaps you're simply there again now, the particular smell of autumn hide work, something between animal and earth and the sharp mineral tang of the brain and fat mixture worked into every skin during tanning, a smell that clung to hands and clothing for days and meant, to anyone who caught it drifting from a camp, that winter preparation was well underway. A buffalo hide arrives at this stage of its life already fleshed and dried, stiff as old wood, nothing like the soft, pliable warmth it will eventually become. And the distance between those two states is entirely a matter of sustained, repetitive labour, performed mostly by the women of the camp, working in groups the way this kind of work has always gone faster and felt lighter when done together. The hide is staked out flat on the ground first, or stretched taut on a wooden frame, and the real work begins with a scraping tool, bone or stone, drawn again and again across the surface to remove every last trace of flesh and fat still clinging to the inner side, a task that takes hours of steady, repetitive motion and leaves the arms aching by the end of a single hide, let alone the several A-family needs finish before the season turns. You watch, or remember watching, the rhythm of it, 3 or 4 women working around the same staked hide, trading places occasionally to rest one set of arms while another takes over, talking through the whole process, the way people do when a task is long enough to need company to make it bearable. Once scraped clean, the hide is worked with the tanning mixture, a paste of animal brains and fat rubbed thoroughly into the skin, chosen not by accident, but because of a piece of practical knowledge passed down as reliably as anything else in this camp, that a hide's own brain, in almost every case, contains close to exactly the right amount of fat needed to properly tan its own skin. The mixture is worked in by hand, kneaded and rubbed across every part of the stretched hide. Then the real transformation begins, the hide worked and pulled and stretched repeatedly over the edge of a rope or a smoothed pole, hour after hour, softening fibres that started the process as stiff as bark into something that will eventually fold and drape like heavy cloth. This softening work alone can take the better part of a full day for a single hide. Hands and forearms doing the same pulling, twisting motion again and again until the material finally, gradually, gives up its stiffness and starts to move the way a finished robe needs to move, close and warm around a sleeping body rather than rigid and awkward. And even once that softening is finished, the hide still needs smoking, held over a low, smouldering fire of specific woods for hours, a step that does something almost invisible but entirely essential, sealing the hide's fibres against becoming stiff and board-like again if it ever gets wet and dries out afterward, the difference between a robe that survives a whole winter of use and one that fails exactly when it's needed most. You think, standing now in the aftermath of the night you actually spent wrapped in one of these finished robes, about how much of that autumn labour was invisible to you in the moment you needed it, how the robe simply existed, already soft, already warm, already exactly the right shape and weight to hold heat against your body through hours of hard cold, as though it had always been that way. It hadn't. It had been made that way deliberately by people who understood in early autumn, with the whole warm remainder of the season still stretching ahead of them, that their own comfort and survival months later depended entirely on doing this unglamorous, repetitive, physically demanding work now while there was still time, rather than waiting until the cold had already arrived to discover what they'd failed to prepare. The same pattern holds true for nearly everything that kept you warm last night. The tipi cover itself, sewn from many hides joined with sinew thread into a single great piece, represents weeks of careful stitching completed long before the poles ever needed raising. The inner liner was tanned and prepared with the same patient labour as the sleeping robes. Even the firewood stacked and ready outside your lodge last night was gathered and split across earlier weeks, specifically so that, on the coldest night of the season so far, nobody had to go searching for fuel in the dark. Winter on the plains was never survived in the moment it arrived. It was survived months in advance through steady, unglamorous, collective labour that asked for patience and skill and a great deal of simple physical effort, all of it invested long before anyone could know exactly how cold or how long the season ahead would actually turn out to be. Not every winter night in this valley unfolds as gently as the one you've just lived through, and it's worth understanding what happens when the weather stops merely testing a lodge and starts genuinely trying to defeat it, because the same structure that felt so calm and steady last night has, on other nights, had to hold against something considerably worse. A true plains blizzard doesn't announce itself gradually the way an ordinary cold evening does. It arrives with a falling barometer and a particular stillness that anyone who has spent enough winters out here learns to recognize and respect, a held breath in the air just before the wind finds its full strength. And when it finally breaks, it breaks all at once, snow turning sideways, visibility collapsing to almost nothing within minutes, temperatures dropping fast enough to feel like a physical blow. On a night like that, the calm, unhurried preparation you watched unfold at the start of this story compresses into something far more urgent. Every lodge in camp gets a final hard check the moment the sky signals what's coming, stakes driven deeper, extra rope lashed around the pole frame near the base for additional stability. Any loose gear brought inside rather than left to become a projectile in wind strong enough to move more than snow. Firewood that might normally be gathered in easy, unhurried trips over several days instead gets hauled in with real speed. extra armfuls stacked inside the lodge itself rather than left in the exposed pile outside, because once the storm fully arrives, stepping outside even briefly becomes genuinely dangerous, the wind and blowing snow together capable of disorienting a person within a few dozen steps of their own doorway. Inside, once the worst of the storm hits, the character of the night changes completely from the quiet, story-filled evening you experienced. The wind no longer simply presses and tests the lodge cover. It screams past it, an almost continuous roar punctuated by harder gusts that make the whole structure shudder audibly, poles flexing slightly at their lashed joints in a way they're specifically designed to do, built with just enough give to bend under extreme load rather than break outright, the way a perfectly rigid structure would. You can hear snow driving hard against the hide, a constant hissing static overlaying the deeper roar of the wind itself, and every so often a gust strong enough to matter will find some small remaining weakness in the outer cover, and the whole lodge will seem to breathe inward for a moment before settling back. On nights like this, nobody sleeps as deeply or as continuously as during an ordinary cold evening. The fire needs closer, more constant attention, not because the storm makes the fire itself less effective, but because everyone inside understands, at some instinctive level bred from lifetimes spent respecting weather like this, that a lodge under this much stress deserves watchful hands rather than fully unguarded sleep. Someone stays genuinely alert through the worst hours, listening to the specific sounds the structure makes, ready to react if a stake works loose or a seam starts to strain in a way that sounds different from ordinary wind noise. This isn't fear exactly, it's simply the appropriate level of attention for a night that has moved from routine cold into something that actually deserves to be called dangerous. An attention built from every previous storm this same family has weathered and survived by respecting exactly this kind of vigilance. And still, through nights like this, the lodge generally holds, not through luck, but through the same accumulated engineering that carried you calmly through the gentler night you actually experienced in this story. The conical shape-shedding wind that would tear apart anything flatter, the staked base refusing to give up its grip on the frozen ground, the flexible pole joints absorbing stress that a rigid structure couldn't survive, the smoke flaps, adjusted and readjusted as the wind direction shifts through the worst of the storm, continuing their essential work of letting the fire breathe without letting the cold flood in behind it. Families who have weathered storms like this together carry a particular quiet confidence afterward, not boastfulness exactly, but the settled knowledge that comes from having tested a structure and a set of skills against the absolute worst a Plains winter can produce, and having come through it together, warm exactly as every generation before them managed to do, using exactly these same careful, hard-won methods. By morning after a storm like that, the camp emerges into a landscape utterly transformed, snow drifted in long, sculpted ridges against every windward lodge wall, familiar paths between tipis buried and needing to be retraced from memory rather than sight, the whole valley wearing a depth of white that makes yesterday's ordinary cold evening seem almost gentle by comparison. But the lodges stand. Smoke rises from the same careful fires, tended through the worst of the night by the same patient, half-waking hands, and families step out into the aftermath, not with astonishment at having survived, but with the quiet, practical satisfaction of people whose preparation did exactly what it was built to do, once again on a night when it genuinely mattered, None of this knowledge, the exact angle for a smoke flap, the right number of poles for a tripod that will hold true through a screaming wind, the precise moment a tanning hide has been softened enough, arrived fully formed in any single person's hands. It was taught patiently, over years, in the same unhurried way most important things get taught in a camp like this one, not through formal lessons set apart from ordinary life, but folded directly into the doing of the work itself. A child standing close beside an adult through task after task, watching first, then helping with the smaller parts, then eventually, one winter, finding their own hands trusted with the harder parts too. You think of a child in this camp, maybe 7 or 8 winters old, too young yet to drive a stake alone with real effectiveness, but never too young to be given a real job within the larger effort, and you watch or remember being watched yourself at that age exactly how that teaching happens. Nobody sits a child down and explains the physics of dead airspace trapped between 2 layers of hide. Instead, the child is handed one end of the inner liner and told, simply, hold this here, and shown where here is, and over enough repetitions of exactly that small, useful task. Winter after winter, an understanding builds that no explanation could have delivered nearly as effectively. By the time that child is old enough to help raise a full lodge on their own, they've already spent years absorbing, hands-on, the logic behind every piece of it, not as abstract knowledge but as something closer to instinct, the kind of deep, practiced understanding that lets an adult's hands finish a task correctly in near darkness without needing to consciously think through each step. This apprenticeship runs in both directions across a lifetime. The same child who once held a corner of the liner while an older sibling worked the lacing pins grows eventually into someone teaching an even younger child the exact same small task. And somewhere in the middle of that long arc, a person becomes genuinely capable, trusted with real responsibility, someone whose own hands, other people's warmth and safety will eventually depend on. You see this playing out constantly across the camp if you watch for it, an older girl showing a younger cousin how to check a stake for looseness, a boy not yet strong enough to drive a stake himself, nonetheless sent to gather exactly the right size of kindling, because that task too matters and teaches its own lesson about what dry, fine, shredded bark looks and feels like compared to material too damp or too coarse to catch easily. Elders hold a particular place in all of this, not simply as sources of instruction, but as the camp's living memory of winters harder than any currently living young person has yet experienced, storms survived decades earlier. Lessons learned the difficult way and carried forward specifically so nobody younger ever has to relearn them through the same difficulty. When an older voice tells a story by the fire as happened in your own lodge on the night you spent here, the story is rarely only entertainment, even when it sounds that way on the surface. Woven through it, often without any obvious announcement, are the same practical lessons that keep this whole camp alive each winter, dressed in narrative, because narrative, it turns out, is remembered far more reliably across generations than a plain list of instructions ever could be. This is, in its quiet way, the deepest layer of everything you've witnessed across this single winter night, and the morning that followed it, the lodge that kept you warm, the fire that was tended through the darkest hours, the layered robes, the carefully chosen valley, None of it exists because any one person figured it out alone. It exists because a very long chain of people, generation reaching back to generation, tested and refined and taught and retaught these exact methods patiently, hands-on, around fires very much like the one that warmed you last night, until the knowledge became so thoroughly embedded in the ordinary rhythm of camp life that a child barely old enough to hold one end of a tipi liner is already, without quite realizing it, beginning to learn everything they'll eventually need to survive a plains winter of their own. You look out across the camp one more time this morning, smoke still rising steady from lodge after lodge, children's voices carrying clear and unbothered through the cold air, an elder's hands checking a lacing seam with the unhurried confidence of long practice, and you understand that what you've actually witnessed across one ordinary cold night in this valley wasn't really a single family's survival at all. It was one more repetition of a pattern this community has been perfecting for longer than anyone could name, a pattern that will keep repeating, taught hand to hand, story to story, winter after winter, for as long as anyone here keeps choosing together to meet the cold with exactly this much patience, exactly this much care, and exactly this much hard-won, generously shared knowledge. Not every difficult winter night looks like the storm you weathered earlier in this story. Some of the hardest nights on the plains carry no wind at all, no driving snow, nothing dramatic enough to announce itself the way a blizzard does. Instead, they arrive quietly, under a perfectly clear sky, and it's worth understanding this other kind of cold, because in its own way it demands just as much respect as any storm, and the people of this camp learned to recognize it just as carefully. You step outside on a night like this, one where the wind that pressed at your lodge on other evenings has fallen completely still, and the first thing you notice is the silence, total and strange after so many nights of listening to hide, cover ripple, and pull against gusts. Above you the sky has gone impossibly clear, stars scattered in numbers you rarely see through any haze of cloud or moisture, and the air itself feels different against your face, dry and sharp in a way that has nothing to do with wind and everything to do with a cold settling straight down, out of a cloudless sky with nothing at all to slow its descent. This is the kind of night you've been taught since childhood that can turn more dangerous than a storm precisely because it looks so calm, so deceptively gentle compared to a howling blizzard that at least announces its own danger honestly. Without cloud cover to hold the day's warmth close to the ground, heat radiates directly up and away into that clear sky all through the night, and the temperature can fall further and faster than during even a significant storm, especially in the deep hours well past midnight, when the ground itself has had the longest possible stretch of clear sky above it to keep losing warmth. The people in this camp know this pattern well, know that a still, star-bright evening in deep winter deserves exactly as much careful preparation as a day that opens with storm clouds gathering on the horizon, and so tonight's fire gets built with the same deliberate care as any other. Tonight's robes get checked and layered with the same attention. Tonight's final rounds of the lodge before sleep happen with no less seriousness for the fact that the sky outside looks, if anything, almost beautiful. Inside your lodge, the stillness outside changes the character of the space in a way you notice immediately. Without wind pressing and testing the cover, the interior holds a different kind of quiet, the fire's low crackle carrying clearly through air that isn't competing with any outside roar, every small sound a shifted robe, a settling ember, a distant call of some night animal out on the silent plain, arriving crisp and distinct, rather than buried under wind noise. You find yourself listening more carefully on a night like this, not out of worry exactly, but because the stillness itself asks for a different kind of attention, a recognition that the cold gathering outside tonight, however calm it looks, is working at a different and in some ways more relentless pace than the wind-driven cold of a stormy evening. The fire tending through a night like this follows its own particular rhythm, feeding a bit more consistently than on a windier night, since there's no gusting to occasionally push extra warmth through the lodge in fits and starts the way wind sometimes paradoxically does, by forcing more draft through the smoke opening. Whoever wakes through these deep, still hours to add wood does so with the same practiced, half-conscious care as always, but with an added awareness that tonight's cold, quiet and patient rather than aggressive and searching deserves just as much respect as any wind-driven storm, if not more, precisely because it's so easy to underestimate. By the deepest part of a night like this, the cold outside has settled into something genuinely severe, cold enough that any exposed skin left uncovered for more than a few minutes would be in real danger, cold enough that even the horses tethered near camp stand close together for shared warmth, their blanketed forms motionless against the star-bright dark. But inside the lodge, wrapped in the same careful layers of buffalo robe and hide that carried you through the storm, none of that severity reaches you directly. The dead air gap behind the liner does its same quiet work, regardless of whether the cold outside arrives on a screaming wind or a perfectly silent sky. The layered bedding holds its same careful warmth. The small, steady fire performs its same essential function. What changes, mostly, is the feeling of the night itself. Less dramatic than a storm, less obviously a battle being actively fought and won, but in its own way just as complete a test of everything this camp has built and passed down across generations. You drift towards sleep this time, listening not to wind but to an almost complete silence, broken only by the fire's low sound and the occasional distant call, carrying with startling clarity across frozen, windless ground, and you understand, settling into the same warm, layered depths that have carried you through every kind of winter night this valley has offered so far, that the people who built this system of shelter and preparation weren't only planning for storms, they were planning for every version of cold the plains could produce, loud or silent, driven by wind or falling straight down from a clear and star-filled sky, ready either way. Survival through a winter night is never only a matter of shelter and fire. It depends just as much on what happens well before dark falls, on the quieter daytime work of keeping a family fed and watered through a season when both of those ordinary tasks become considerably harder than they were only a few months earlier, and it's worth following that work now through one full winter day in this camp to understand everything that has to happen before anyone can properly settle in for another night like the ones you've already lived through. Water is the first challenge of any winter morning, and it's usually a woman's task, one undertaken early, often before full light, carrying a hide container or a woven vessel down to the river's edge where a hole has to be kept open through ice that may have formed a foot thick or more overnight. This isn't a one-time job. The same hole gets broken open again and again through the winter, chopped clear each morning with a stone or bone tool, because letting it freeze over completely means starting the harder work of breaking fresh ice from scratch rather than simply clearing a thin, new skin that formed overnight. You watch, or remember watching, the careful balance in this task, moving quickly enough in the bitter early air to avoid lingering too long at exposed water's edge, but carefully enough not to slip on ice-slicked footing at a riverbank, where a fall could mean a genuinely dangerous soaking in temperatures that turn wet clothing into a real emergency within minutes. Food through the winter relies heavily on preparation completed months earlier during the richer months of late summer and early autumn, when buffalo were plentiful and the whole camp turned its attention to processing far more meat than could possibly be eaten immediately. Pemmican, made from dried meat pounded fine and mixed with rendered fat and sometimes dried berries, keeps for remarkably long stretches without spoiling and forms much of what sustains a family through the leanest, coldest months, when hunting becomes harder and game scarcer. You think of the parfleshes, those folded rawhide cases stored in the gap between the lodge's outer cover and inner liner, exactly the kind of practical storage space that Gap was always meant to provide, holding pemmican and dried meat and whatever else needs protecting from both weather and animals through the long winter months ahead. A midwinter meal, prepared over the same central fire that warmed the lodge through the previous night, often means a simple stew, dried meat, and whatever roots or other stored foods remain, simmered slowly in a hide or clay vessel, set near enough to the fire's edge to cook, without needing the elaborate cooking arrangements a summer camp might support. The whole process happens close to the ground, close to the fire's steady heat, the same economical use of limited warmth that governs every other winter decision in this lodge. Nothing about winter cooking wastes fuel or effort. Everything happens efficiently, close to the source of heat that's already burning for other reasons, one fire serving the double duty of warming the lodge and preparing whatever food the day requires. Beyond food and water, winter days carry their own steady rhythm of maintenance work, hides checked for wear, tools sharpened or repaired, clothing mended against tears that would let cold air find its way in during the coming night. You notice an older woman near your lodge working steadily at a moccasin seam, replacing worn sinew thread with fresh, unhurried, but attentive. Because a small tear ignored today becomes a genuine problem on some future cold night when it finally gives way entirely. This kind of quiet maintenance work fills much of a winter day, not dramatic, rarely discussed as anything special, simply the ordinary, steady labor that keeps every piece of a family's winter equipment functioning exactly as well as it needs to when the temperature drops hard again after dark. Horses need attention too through these winter days, brought to sheltered ground where they can paw through snow to reach whatever grass remains beneath it, checked for condition, sometimes given supplemental care if the season has turned harsh enough that natural grazing alone won't sustain them. Their well-being matters for more than sentiment. A camp's mobility, its ability to relocate if conditions demand it, its capacity for hunting when game does appear within reach, depends entirely on horses that have been kept in reasonable condition through months when maintaining that condition takes real, deliberate effort. By the time afternoon light begins its early winter fade, the day's accumulated small tasks, water carried, food prepared, tools mended, animals tended, firewood gathered and stacked, have quietly built toward exactly the readiness that will matter again once darkness falls and another long cold night begins. None of it looks, from any single moment, like survival work exactly. It looks like ordinary daily life, the kind of steady, unremarkable labour that fills most hours of most days in any settled community, but strung together, day after day, through an entire winter season. This is precisely the labour that makes every one of the nights you've already witnessed in this story possible, the invisible daytime foundation beneath every warm, well-fed, well-sheltered evening this camp manages to produce. There is a dimension to this lodge that goes beyond the purely practical, and it's worth sitting with it now, because the people who built and lived inside structures like this one never understood the tipi as a purely mechanical solution to a purely mechanical problem. The doorway of a traditional lodge nearly always faces east, oriented deliberately toward the rising sun. And this isn't decoration or coincidence, it's a choice carrying real meaning. A small daily alignment between the shape of a family's home and the movement of the sky above it, so that the very first light of each new day reaches directly into the space where that family lives. You think of stepping out through your own lodge's doorway on a clear winter morning, exactly as you did earlier in this story, and how that first low light met you directly, unobstructed, because the doorway was placed with exactly this moment in mind. There is something in that daily alignment that speaks to how thoroughly this whole structure was understood as more than shelter alone. The lodge poles themselves, tied together near their top, in that first tripod raised at the very start of construction, carry their own significance beyond simple structural necessity. Understood by many Plains nations as representing foundational values, sometimes obedience, respect, humility, happiness, depending on the specific tradition and teaching passed down within a given family or nation, each pole meaning something before it ever becomes load-bearing. The fire at the centre holds its own weight beyond warmth and cooking. Positioned at the literal middle of the lodge beneath the opening where smoke rises up toward the sky, that central fire sits at the meeting point between the earth beneath the lodge floor and the sky visible through the smoke hole above. A small daily reminder, present in every lodge across the whole camp, of a connection between the ground a family stands on and the wider world, stretching out beyond and above it. You watched that smoke rise night after night in this story, straight up through the narrow opening at the peak of the poles, and there is something worth noticing in how consistently that image recurs. Warmth and breath and prayer, all rising together through the same narrow gap toward the same open sky, whether anyone in the lodge consciously thinks about it that way on any given ordinary evening or not. Morning prayers or quiet, private moments of reflection often accompany that first light entering through the east-facing doorway, a brief pause before the day's practical work begins. Not separate from the day's survival, but woven directly into it, gratitude offered for having survived another cold night, for the fire that held, for the robes that kept their warmth, for the family gathered safely inside one more time. This isn't treated as remarkable or set apart from ordinary life. It's simply part of how a day properly begins, as natural and expected as checking the fire or stepping out to gauge the morning's temperature. The whole shape of the lodge, circular, without corners, echoes something many Plains traditions hold as significant, a shape found throughout the natural world in the sun and moon, in the seasons turning, in the horizon itself, viewed from open plains ground, and living inside that shape night after night, season after season, was never entirely separate from a broader way of understanding a family's place within a much larger, continuously turning world. You settle back into your own sleeping robes, remembering this, understanding a little more fully now why so much care went into every choice you've watched made across this story, not simply because careful choices happened to keep people warm, though they certainly did that, but because those same choices carried meaning that ran deeper than warmth alone. A whole way of living arranged with intention at every level, practical and otherwise. Outside, the fire's smoke continues its steady rise toward the narrow strip of sky at the peak of the poles, exactly as it has every night in this story so far, and exactly as it will continue doing through however many more winters this particular lodge, or lodges built exactly like it, continues standing in this valley or others like it across the wide plains beyond. Warmth rising towards sky, sky reaching down each morning through an east-facing doorway to touch a family just waking, a circle repeating itself night after night, day after day, in a shape and a rhythm carried forward by people who understood, long before anyone wrote any of it down, that survival and meaning were never really separate questions at all. Winter does not mean every family in this camp faces the season entirely alone, and one of the quieter but more important parts of surviving it well is understanding how households here look out for one another when circumstances turn difficult for any single lodge. You think of an evening not so different from the ones you've already spent in this story, when a neighbouring family's fire, visible earlier through their own smoke rising against the dusk, seems thinner than it should, slower to build, and how quickly that small observed detail moves someone in your own lodge to act on it rather than simply notice it and move on. Hospitality on a night like this isn't treated as generosity in any special or remarkable sense. It's simply understood as how a winter camp survives as a whole rather than as a scattering of separate, competing households. If a hunt has gone poorly for one family, if illness has kept able hands from finishing enough firewood before dark, if some misfortune, a torn lodge cover, a fire that got away and damaged stored supplies, has left one household short of what it needs to get comfortably through a hard night, the expectation running through this entire camp is that others will notice and others will help, without needing to be formally asked and without the help being treated afterward as a debt requiring repayment on any strict accounting. You watch in this remembered or imagined evening a portion of your own family's prepared food carried the short distance to a neighbouring lodge, extra firewood handed over from a supply gathered with exactly this kind of sharing already anticipated, because winter preparation in a camp like this one was never calculated purely at the level of a single household's needs. Families here understand, from lifetimes of experience and from the accumulated memory of harder winters than this one, that misfortune moves unpredictably from lodge to lodge across a season, and that the family helped generously tonight may well be the family extending exactly that same generosity to someone else only a few winters from now. The roles reversing as circumstance demands, with nobody keeping careful score of exactly who owes what to whom. This spirit of mutual support extends into the ordinary daily texture of camp life, well beyond moments of clear crisis. Meat from a successful hunt gets shared beyond the household of the hunter who brought it down, following patterns of distribution understood and expected throughout the camp, ensuring that even families without an especially skilled or fortunate hunter among them still eat reasonably well through the season. Elders without close family nearby to care for them directly are nonetheless looked after, fed, kept warm, included in the daily rhythm of whichever lodge takes on responsibility for them, not as an obligation grudgingly fulfilled, but as simply how a functioning winter camp treats its most vulnerable members. Children move relatively freely between lodges too, in ways that would look, to eyes unfamiliar with how this camp actually works, almost like every adult here shares some responsibility for every child, which in a meaningful sense is close to exactly true. A child sent on an errand to a neighbouring lodge is fed there if hunger strikes before the errand's finished, warmed by whatever fire happens to be nearest if the cold catches them between destinations, corrected gently if their behaviour calls for it by whichever adult happens to be present, with full confidence that this same casual, distributed care extends just as readily to every other child moving through camp on any given day. You think about how different last night, the one you actually spent inside your own family's lodge, might have felt without this wider web of support surrounding it, how much heavier the responsibility for pure survival would sit on a single household facing a hard plains winter, with no expectation of help from anyone beyond its own immediate members. That isn't the situation this camp has built for itself, and understanding why matters as much as understanding the mechanics of pole and hide and fire that carried you through the actual night. A single lodge, however well built, however carefully provisioned, remains vulnerable in ways that an entire interconnected camp, sharing food and firewood and labour and care across its many households, simply isn't. The warmth you felt last night came from your own family's fire, built with your own family's careful hands. But it existed inside a much larger circle of warmth extended across an entire camp of people who had long ago decided, and kept deciding, winter after winter, that surviving this season was something done far better together than any single lodge could ever manage entirely alone. Even in a lodge this carefully built, this well provisioned, this thoroughly tested against wind and cold and blizzard alike, illness and injury still find their way in sometimes. And it's worth understanding how this camp handles exactly that, because the same careful, layered approach that shaped the lodge itself shaped its approach to caring for someone unwell through a hard winter night as well. You think of a night different from the calm, ordinary one you spent earlier in this story, a night when someone in a nearby lodge, perhaps a child, perhaps an elder, whose body handles the deep cold less easily than it once did, wakes fevered or coughing, and the whole quiet rhythm of that lodge shifts immediately to meet the new and more urgent need. The fire in a lodge caring for someone unwell burns a little warmer than usual, tended a little more attentively, because a body already fighting illness needs every advantage, a stable, generous warmth can offer against a cold that would otherwise tax it further. Specific plants and roots gathered and dried in earlier seasons specifically with exactly this kind of need in mind get prepared into teas or poultices, knowledge held carefully by particular members of the camp, often older women whose accumulated understanding of which plant treats, which complaint represents its own form of expertise, every bit as refined and hard-won as the knowledge that goes into raising a lodge or tanning a hide. This knowledge doesn't arrive from nowhere on the night it's needed. It was gathered, tested, and passed down across generations of careful observation. Exactly like every other form of expertise this camp depends on to survive its winters. Someone stays close through a night like this, watching, offering water, adjusting robes, present in a way that goes beyond the ordinary, half-waking fire-tending of a typical calm evening. You think of how the whole extended web of mutual care described a moment ago in this story extends naturally into exactly this kind of situation. Other lodges nearby, aware that illness has visited a neighbouring family, offering whatever additional warmth or food or simple presence might ease the difficulty of the night, because a sick child or a struggling elder is understood throughout this camp as everyone's shared concern rather than one household's isolated burden to manage entirely alone. The lodge itself, even in this more difficult circumstance, continues doing exactly the same quiet structural work it does every other night. The layered insulation still holds its warmth. The liner still channels air and smoke exactly as it was built to. The robes still trap heat against a body that needs it more urgently tonight than most nights. In this sense, the same engineering that carried you gently through an ordinary calm evening earlier in this story becomes, on a harder night like this one, something closer to genuine medicine. Warmth reliably delivered and reliably held exactly when a struggling body needs it most. A foundation of physical comfort and stability beneath whatever additional care, herbal or simply attentive, the people tending the sick person are able to offer alongside it. By morning, more often than not, whatever illness visited in the night has eased somewhat with rest and warmth and careful tending, though not always, and this camp understands that too, understands that not every difficult night resolves as cleanly as the calm, successful evenings that have filled most of this story so far. Winters here were not without real loss, and the people living through them knew this as clearly and as honestly as anyone could. But even in that harder truth, the pattern holds. Whatever could be done through careful shelter, careful fire, careful knowledge of plants and remedies, careful mutual support extended across an entire connected camp, was done, fully and without reservation, because that was simply what this community understood itself to owe its most vulnerable members on the hardest nights a Plains winter could produce. You think, settling back into the calmer rhythm of your own family's ordinary evening as this particular thread of the story closes, about how much quiet strength runs beneath everything you've witnessed across this whole winter night and the days surrounding it. Not the dramatic strength of a single dramatic act, but something steadier and in its way more impressive. An entire community's patient, accumulated readiness to meet whatever the season brings, calm nights and storms alike, ordinary comfort and occasional real hardship alike, always with the same careful attention, the same shared labour, the same deep well of inherited knowledge that has carried this camp, and camps exactly like it scattered across this same wide plain, safely through winter after winter, for as long as anyone here can remember, and for a great many winters longer than that besides. Winter on the plains does not end all at once, and it's worth understanding how this camp reads the season's slow turning, because the same careful attention that went into building a lodge against the coldest nights also goes into noticing gradually the small signs that the hardest stretch of the season has begun, at last, to loosen its grip. You think of a day unlike any of the ones you've spent so far in this story, a day when the air carries something different in it, a softness beneath the cold that wasn't there a week earlier. Snow along the south-facing slopes losing its hard crust and starting to sink and darken at the edges where sun reaches it longest. Sometimes this shift arrives suddenly. A warm wind moving in off the mountains far to the west, strong and dry, capable of melting a startling depth of snow within a single day. The kind of wind this camp has learned to recognize by feel before anyone even needs to comment on it aloud. You step outside on a morning like this and notice, almost immediately, how differently the cold sits against your skin compared to even a few days earlier. Less a blade, and more a simple chill, the kind that a lighter layer of clothing can manage without the careful, urgent preparation that governed every evening earlier in this story. Icicles along the lodge's outer seams begin dripping steadily by midday. The river's ice, so solid and reliable through the deep winter months, starts showing dark cracks and open water along its edges where the current runs fastest. Nobody in this camp mistakes an early thaw for the true end of winter, though, and this too is knowledge earned through hard experience rather than simple hope. A warm spell in the depth of the season can retreat as quickly as it arrived, cold air moving back in behind it with real force, sometimes bringing storms every bit as serious as anything faced earlier in the winter. So even as the days lengthen and the worst of the deep cold begins gradually to loosen, the same careful habits continue. Firewood keeps getting gathered, the lodge keeps getting checked and maintained. Nobody lets the visible signs of an eventual spring convince them to abandon the disciplined caution that carried this whole camp safely through the season's hardest months. Still, something in the mood of the camp shifts, unmistakably, as these first signs appear. Conversations by the evening fire start turning more and more often toward the season ahead rather than the one being endured. Talk of where the summer camp might be located this year, which family groups plan to travel together when the time comes to move. Early speculation about how the coming buffalo hunts might go based on what signs the winter itself offered about the health and movement of the herds. Children, cooped up through the hardest weeks by cold too severe for much outdoor activity, start spending longer stretches outside again, their voices carrying across a camp that already sounds, in some small way, lighter than it did only weeks earlier. You think about the particular satisfaction that settles over a family, over an entire camp, in this stretch of the season, not the relief of having simply endured something difficult, though that relief is real enough, but something closer to quiet pride. The accumulated evidence of an entire winter's careful decisions proving out exactly as intended. The lodge that was raised so carefully at the very start of this story still stands, its cover intact, its poles unbroken despite whatever storms tested them along the way. The robes that were tanned and softened through weeks of autumn labour carried their warmth through every single night that demanded it. The firewood gathered and stacked with such attention lasted exactly as long as it needed to. Nothing failed. Nothing had to fail because every piece of this whole intricate system, the shelter, the fire, the food, the mutual care extended across the whole connected camp, was built with precisely this outcome in mind from the very beginning. As the days continue lengthening and the deep snow begins its slow retreat from the valley floor, this camp will eventually begin the familiar work of breaking down these same lodges, packing them onto travois, and moving on toward whatever the coming season asks of them next. But that work belongs to a different story than this one. Tonight, with the thaw still young and uncertain and true winter still capable of returning hard for one more difficult stretch before it finally fully releases its hold, this camp settles once more into the same careful, patient rhythm that has carried it this far, fires tended, robes arranged, doorways still facing east toward whatever the next morning brings. Let's return, for this next to last part of the story, to the same lodge where this whole night began. Because there's something worth sitting with in coming back to a familiar place after everything you've now seen and understood about the wider world surrounding it. The poles are the same poles raised in the day's fading light at the very start of this story. The cover is the same cover pinned and staked against that first evening's gathering wind. The fire rebuilt and tended, and rebuilt again, across however many nights this story has now carried you through, still burns in the same worn circle of stones at the centre of everything. You settle into your sleeping place once more, the same layered robes, the same willow platform lifted just enough off the cold ground beneath it, and you notice this time how differently the whole space feels now that you understand everything sitting quietly behind its simple, familiar shape. The liner hanging a few feet in from the outer wall isn't just hide anymore in your eyes. It's the patient physics of rising warm air and settling cold. The storage shelf holding parfleches of pemmican prepared through autumn's careful labour, the whole invisible machinery that turned a cone of poles and hide into somewhere genuinely, reliably safe to sleep through the hardest nights a Plains winter could offer. The fire at the centre isn't only warmth and light anymore either. It's the meeting point between earth and sky that sent smoke rising through that narrow opening towards stars, visible on clear nights and storm clouds on harder ones, the same fire tended by half-waking hands through deep cold nights and screaming blizzards alike, the same fire that will greet tomorrow's east-facing dawn exactly as it has every morning this whole winter. Prayer and practicality woven together so completely that neither one quite makes sense anymore without the other. Outside tonight the wind has settled into something gentle, nothing like the testing gusts of the storm night or the vast, wind-driven cold of the clear night that followed it, closer instead to the calm, ordinary evening where this whole story first began. You can hear the low murmur of the wider camp settling in around you, other fires being banked for the night, other families following the same patient rituals your own family has followed. generation reaching back through generation, refined and taught and retaught, until the whole complex, layered system stopped looking like a solution to a problem at all, and simply became, instead, the accepted, ordinary shape of how a family survives, and even, on nights like this one, genuinely enjoys a winter evening together. You think of everyone this story has introduced along the way, the elder, whose voice carried a story through the first night's darkness, the child learning by holding one small corner of a liner, the neighbouring family whose thinner fire drew quiet, unremarkable help from your own household, the person tending a sick relative through a harder night than this one, the whole wide circle of a camp that decided collectively and repeatedly that surviving this season was work best done together. None of them are separate from the warmth settling over you now as your own eyes grow heavy. They are, every one of them, part of exactly what makes this particular warmth possible, an entire community's accumulated care folded into the simple, ordinary fact of a fire burning steadily at the centre of a lodge while a family sleeps safely around it. The last of the fire's flame settles into steady coals as your own breathing slows to match the unhurried rhythm of everyone else already asleep around you. Somewhere above, through the narrow gap where the poles meet, the sky holds its familiar scatter of winter stars, patient and distant and entirely unable to reach past the careful shelter surrounding you. Tomorrow will bring its own version of everything this whole story has already shown you, water gathered from a river's broken ice, hides mended, firewood restacked, an east-facing doorway, greeting whatever light the morning offers. But tonight, that tomorrow, can wait. Tonight, there is only this, warmth held in careful layers against a cold this whole camp has learned, across generations, exactly how to meet and how to survive, together, one more ordinary, extraordinary winter night at a time. There is a way of measuring a way of life that has nothing to do with how it's remembered from the outside in old photographs or museum displays or the pages of a book written by someone who never once spent a full winter inside a lodge like the one you've lived inside across this entire story, and everything to do with a much simpler question. Did it work? Did it keep people alive and warm and fed and cared for through a season genuinely capable of killing anyone unprepared for it year after year, generation after generation, for longer than anyone could precisely count? By that measure, what you've witnessed across this single winter night and across the wider season it belongs to stands as something worth real, unhurried admiration. Nothing about this system arrived by accident. The conical shape that shed wind no flat wall could have managed. The liner that turned ordinary hide into something functioning almost exactly like modern insulation, built from nothing but careful observation of how warm and cold air actually move. The layered robes born from weeks of unglamorous, physically demanding autumn labour that held their warmth through temperatures cold enough to threaten a life in minutes. The small, disciplined fire tended through half-waking hours by hands that had done this so many times it had become closer to instinct than conscious effort. The whole camp's careful clustering into a sheltered valley chosen generations earlier and returned to winter after winter. The deep, patient teaching that passed every piece of this knowledge from old hands to young ones long before any of it needed writing down. because a way of surviving this thoroughly proven simply got lived and shown and practiced until it became inseparable from the ordinary rhythm of an entire people's life. This is not a story about scarcity or hardship treated as its own kind of tragedy, though the plains winter these families faced was genuinely, seriously dangerous, and the people living through it never pretended otherwise. It's a story about mastery, about a level of understanding, refined patiently over an almost unimaginable stretch of accumulated winters, sophisticated enough to turn animal hide and wooden poles into shelter, reliable enough to trust with a family's life night after night, storm after storm, for as long as that knowledge kept being carried forward, hand to hand, story to story, exactly the way you watched it happen across this entire night. So as you settle now into whatever bed you're actually resting in tonight, warm and safe in ways this story's own long winter nights had to work so carefully to achieve, spare a last unhurried thought for the families who lived this, not once. Not as a single dramatic test of endurance, but as the accepted, ordinary shape of an entire season, every single year, for generation after generation before you. They built shelter that outperformed the wind. They tended fire that outlasted the darkest hours. They cared for each other, household to household, elder to child, across an entire connected camp that understood deeply and completely that surviving this season was something done far better together than alone. And they slept, warm and safe, exactly the way you're about to now, wrapped in careful layers built from nothing but patient hands, inherited knowledge, and a very old, very thorough understanding of exactly what it takes to meet a brutal winter night and come through it, once again, ready for whatever the next one asks. Thank you for spending this long, quiet night here on Bedtime Survivalist. If this journey through a plains winter camp helped carry you towards sleep, a like helps this channel keep finding stories exactly like it, and subscribing means you won't miss whatever quiet corner of history we visit next. Let us know in the comments where you drifted off tonight, and what season it is where you are right now. The fire has burned down to its last patient coals, the wind outside has finally gone still, and everyone in this lodge, including you, has earned a long, deep, undisturbed rest. Sleep well. You are warm. You are safe. And morning, when it comes, will still be facing east, exactly as it always has.